Hey, U.S. history students, it's Mr. Baker again. This is Baker's Corner. Hope you're doing well. This is actually going to be our third lesson in a four-part series on the basic nuts and bolts of the Roaring Twenties. And I just want to kind of bring to your attention what's on the screen. We have not talked a lot about cultural and social things, but I think there's still some room for us to maybe start off by reflecting on what we've talked about, what we've learned so far. So I want you to think, maybe pause your screen, write a few things down, and then kind of see, what you came up with. But in three phrases, describe what comes to mind when you think about the Roaring Twenties, and maybe try to categorize them into political, social, cultural, and or economic ideas. And the one thing I want to bring to your attention with parts 3 and 4 of this series is that there's a lot of potential for there to be overlap between things that are cultural and social. Okay. So anyway, just to bring your attention. So we're going to spend most of our time today looking at social things, but that'll kind of bleed a little bit into the cultural side. So what'd you come up with? Political, right? Did you connect something political to also something that could be cultural and social, right? So like the immigration quotas that impacted people from different groups. That definitely was a political decision, but it also affected obviously the numbers of people coming into the country from different parts. Okay, how could you also look at economic ideals that we or ideas that we looked at? The idea of consumerism changing. Is the 1920s kind of like a third wave of what you might call an industrial revolution in a sense? Historians love to debate that stuff for good reason. Okay, or on the other side, is it a continuation simply of what has been going on for the previous 30, 40, 50, 60 years or whatever? Okay. So something to keep in mind when we're looking at social accomplishment. I like to refer guys to social as anything that really has a direct effect on people, their relationships with other people, the way that they're actually going to kind of accomplish things in that regard, etc. Okay, cultural figures in a sense could also kind of make a connection. Okay. And the one thing, as we notice, is that sports are not new to the 1920s, but certainly the idea of personalities within sports, you're going to start to hear a lot more about, like Babe Ruth, Jim Thorpe. Okay. There's a story about even a boxer by the name of Jack Dempsey that comes up a lot. And guys, the one thing we notice about Babe Ruth is that when we think of him, we think of an icon, right? We think of even Jim Thorpe when you think of um, obviously a guy that has the potential to be able to, like I said in my previous lesson, guys, with celebrities, have, just about any skill that you could find with sports, or at least that kind of thing. And he's going to be able to just be a natural at those things. Okay. Babe Ruth, as you can see here, is going to be, as you can see, mostly attached to baseball, although there certainly is a cultural connection as well. And aviation, right? I don't know if any of you guys really think about that in terms of social things, but like we said last time, Charles Lindbergh is going to be one of the more important people. Now, remember what he did, guys. If you look at the map down here, he is the first to actually fly across the Atlantic from New York City over to Paris, France. Okay. And so I want you to think, all right, why would that be such a big deal? Okay. And a lot of you are thinking, well, it's the first time it happened. Okay. That's a true statement. But guys, why would that be something that people would see him as a humongous celebrity? What kind of prestige does it bring? It brought a lot of attention to him. Okay. It just so happened, this is an unfortunate part of his experience in the 20s and 30s, is that he actually had a child that was kidnapped. Okay. And you can read the story more on your own, but this really is going to be a big thing. The thing that's interesting too, guys, as we transition into the the kind of like the leading up to World War II time period, is that Lindbergh is such a big celebrity still that he actually has a lot to say about decisions made by people like Franklin D. Roosevelt as president, and it creates a rivalry between him and FDR. Now, a lot of you are thinking, well, Mr. Baker, that's down the line in the 30s and the early 40s. But we notice, guys, that if you're not a celebrity, you know, your words are probably not going to be quite as impactful. All right. It's kind of like today, somebody like LeBron James speaks, right, about whatever issue it could be. And most people are going to take notice. Why? Because of not just the nature of him being good at the sport, but also how he represents, kind of like the ambassador of a cause for a particular game or a particular group. All right. And I think Lindbergh was very similar to that. Okay. At the end of the day, guys, take a look here. Development of sports figures leads to development of a heroic culture for the country, even a celebrity culture. Okay. And I want you guys to think as we start to look more in the lesson today with the emergence of what's called a mass media, right? Now, mass media to you and I is going to be instant TV, internet, things like the social media that we're all familiar with. Okay, but back then you're going to remember, guys, you're talking more about the expansion of newspapers, but also radio, right? So imagine how these people are literally in some ways going to constantly be in the spotlight. And then you throw on top of it the accomplishments, as we'll look at in a moment, guys, a moment about things like folks that represent the silver screen through Hollywood and movies and things. And you're noticing a really neat amount of social development that brings a lot of attention to these people as celebrities. Okay. Now, we cannot throw out the importance of social development unless we also talk about the way that post World War I will affect, you guessed it, the women of American society. Okay. So this is social, political, cultural as well. Okay. So what do we notice, guys? World War One. Guys, think about what we said. Women are going to be pretty active in the workforce, keeping the country afloat, if you will, kind of the home fires burning, as I said in that lesson. Okay. And what's going to happen shortly after the war is over? Right starting the 1920s time period, it's actually going to be the 19th Amendment. Do y'all remember what the 19th Amendment did that has a big effect on women socially and especially politically? You got it. Progressivism at work. The idea of expanding voting rights. Okay. And it just so happened that in 1920, that's going to be the year that women across the board get the right to vote. Okay. Now, a lot of you are like, well, Mr. Baker, that's important. What about it outside of that's essential? Well, guys, in 1920, that completely changes things. Okay. When you have about half or more of our population that are now able to cast a ballot for senator, that are now able to cast a ballot for things like House rep, president, okay, even though the Electoral College is the one that elects the president, you still have an opportunity to vote. Governors of states, state reps, the list goes on, even mayors of towns and cities. Okay, guys, it gets a lot of political power and authority to a lot of these women. All right, it just so happened in 1920, a lot of you are thinking, well, Mr. Baker, who was the first president or candidate to actually be elected by a lot of the women vote? And it's going to be Warren G. Harding. Okay. And so Harding is going to really work pretty hard in some ways to try to draw in the vote of the American woman. And of course, as we know, that it worked. Now, here's the thing that's interesting. Okay. So all these years leading up to the eventual passage of this 19th Amendment in 1920, a lot of people are like, well, man, women are just going to go out and vote in droves, in other words, large numbers. It didn't really happen as in as large of numbers as people expected. Okay. And I want you guys to think about why that might be the case. Because if you're Susan B. Anthony, right, which by the way, this is really sad to think about, but it's true, does not survive to see this 19th Amendment added to our Constitution, you're probably rolling around in your grave perhaps thinking, why not? Right? I mean, this has been an uphill battle. It's been one that we've been actually fighting for, 80 plus years now. Okay. And here it is. You're not actually following through with that. Okay. But some women, for whatever reason, were not as comfortable doing it. It was not just men that opposed the right, but keep in mind, some women were very vocal about it as well. Okay. And then, guys, I want you to think about the way that having more, recognition in political circles is going to affect women. And think about the pictures that you see there, the flappers. How much do you all know about the flappers? How would these women look different, perhaps, and even maybe act different, right, for their behavior than previous generations? All right. Well, you notice the shorter hair up here a little bit. It's not really as noticeable as you would see if you Google it more. You notice like their skirts are shorter. Okay. You notice like the T-toed shoes a little bit in both pictures. You notice like the dresses. I read a story, guys, a few years ago that said the average dress of a woman leading up to the flapper movement was, I think, anywhere from 12 to 15 yards of fabric. The average flapper dress was, I think, between 3 and 5. Okay. So that's a sizable change. And I want you guys to think about this represents a very interesting and a very essential generation of women. All right. So how are these women going to really have to, interact in American society? And how do you think they're going to have to basically deal with, a lot of a lot of families, grandmothers, grandfathers, even moms, dads, etc., probably having some pretty strong opinions about this. You're going to have to learn to really carry yourself in a very different type of society. Okay. Now, women, because of their social change and things like that and political change, you notice, guys, you're going to see some major breakthroughs. Women's issues are going to become really big, or continue, excuse me, to be really big following the 1920 19th Amendment. Okay. So Jeanette Rankin, guys, remember that's her picture right there. She's going to represent the first woman in Congress. Now, something to keep in the back of our minds, she is not elected post 1920. She is actually elected, I think it was in 1916, leading up to the First World War, right? So she actually was from, I believe it was the state of Montana, who was very progressive. That state was very progressive with their voting rights. Okay, but that's a huge breakthrough. She was one of the few women, if you recall from our discussion, guys, in World War One, an American Declaration of War, who actually opposed it on the grounds of being more pacifist. Okay, and then what do we notice, guys? That's probably becoming, if not the biggest women's issue of the 1920s, certainly one of the larger ones, and it's going to be the issue of birth control. Okay, so guys, a lot of times, if you think about movements, like we've said before, reform, etc., they almost always have goals, strategies, and certain leaders attached to them. Margaret Sanger is going to be the major advocate of this particular movement in the 1920s. Okay. Before Margaret Sanger starts to actually get active with promoting, some people would say birth control, reproductive rights, or whatever we want to call it. Okay. You notice that it was basically illegal, right, in America, in the United States, to actually pass around things like, even information about how to be careful with certain decisions and things. I'll leave it very basic for the time being. Okay. And so, guys, as you can imagine, Sanger is going to feel very strongly about this. Now, why? All right. We're not going to get too political on this, guys, but at the end of the day, she makes a lot of arguments along the lines of things like health concerns. The average woman in 1900, if you didn't know this, was having 4 children for every woman. So that's the life expectant, or I'm sorry, the rate of birth. Okay, birth rate, excuse me. And the other thing, you guys, you have to keep in mind is that while healthcare is improving, you still see a sizable number of babies that are not living beyond a year. They call that infant mortality rate. And then also, guys, think about the toll that a large number of births is going to have on women. Now, the other thing you notice as far as women and their rights in this time period is going to be rights such as the idea of divorce, things like that. Okay, so obviously, as you could imagine, very traditional America and society in general is going to have something to say about this, but it is something to definitely keep in mind. Okay, so very important to understand that. And then if you're looking at women, guys, in the idea of recreation in sports and things, you got to understand the essential name that we associate with Amelia Earhart. Again, she was the first woman to fly across the Atlantic Ocean. Gertrude Ederle, however, kind of a cool story, it's not on the slide here, was the first woman to actually swim the English Channel. And that's a pretty big accomplishment in the area of sports and certainly things along those lines. Okay. So as far as transitioning, guys, to things like literature and things like, music and things like that. Okay. Cultural as well. There's a blending here, guys. We notice that we also see a lot of literary achievement. Okay. So I know a lot of you guys, if you have some of my wonderful colleagues in English in junior year in North Carolina, you study a lot of the literature of the Lost Generation. The big thing, guys, with these Lost Generation authors is not everybody really responded well to them. Okay. And so, you're going to notice, you can pause the screen if you need to, Sinclair Lewis, F. Scott Fitzgerald, Ernest Hemingway is another one that gets a lot of attention. This is kind of the group that you associate with their literary scholarship. Okay. But one of the bigger things that they talked about, they really depicted a lot of the cultural things of the 1920s with the prohibition and some of the things associated with the 20s materialism and so forth. And guys, for a lot of people that liked the concept of materialism, the concept of really kind of developing consumer culture more, you could argue that some of the concerns of these lost generation authors were, what, this materialism is going to come back and really have a negative effect, right? And you could argue, well, man, did they have a crystal ball to be able to predict things like stock market crash, the problem with having surplus, as a major issue moving forward? And maybe they were onto something with their ideas. Okay. And because of that, people didn't really always respond well to them. So they become kind of disconnected. Okay. Which is one of the reasons why we associate them with that lost generation. Okay. Um, Another really cool area of social and cultural development is going to be what we associate with the Jazz Age. So my question, guys, is what do you know about the Jazz Age? I know a lot of times we think of music that is very different. It's bold. It's one of my favorite kinds of music out there. How is it different, and why does society? How does it kind of get kind of infiltrated into places like Harlem, places like Chicago, etc.? A lot of that goes back to places like New Orleans, bringing it up rivers like the Mississippi, places like that, and eventually you have this big influx. There's a downside to this. All right. And the downside is, guys, is that for a lot of these, as you can see, African American jazz artists, Louis Armstrong, Duke Ellington, etc., Bessie Smith's another one that I really like a lot. The one thing that you notice, guys, is that they played in a lot of clubs that were owned by predominantly white owners. And so they could play to generate crowds and things like that. But there were still, even though a lot of these were northern places, there still was a presence of segregated areas. And so you would not see a lot of African Americans that were actually located in crowds and things. All right. So I want to point that out to you for a couple of reasons. The biggest one is that I think we need to understand that a lot of these issues related to like race, et cetera, prejudice, discrimination, et cetera, is not just unique to southern cities and places like that. You see that also in parts of the North, et cetera. Okay. However, I have a question for all of you. One historian put it like this. I thought it was an interesting observation that for a lot of these, people that eventually resisted rock and roll, that was, of course, in the 50s moving forward, especially, and then also even rap or hip hop, if you will, in the 80s moving forward, that a lot of the same kinds of resistance was given to people of the Jazz Age. And it's interesting. I want you all guys to think about why would that maybe be the case? Because the music is different. It's bolder, it's louder, it's the kind of music that, perhaps some people would argue would incite different behaviors. Okay. So that is something to definitely keep in the back of our minds. Now, with that being said, another kind of like connection to Harlem with music is definitely going to be what we associate with the literature of African Americans, and that is going to be the Harlem Renaissance. Okay. I have a feeling you're going to read some cool poetry and some stories by people like Langston Hughes, James Weldon Johnson, etc. Okay. And guys, think about what would be some things that would probably become fairly common from a lot of these African American writers. That, by the way, is a picture of Langston Hughes, which is probably the most well-known one. And they're going to be talking about things like the Great Migration of African Americans northward during World War One, right, to cities that had a lot of industries, and working in places like Detroit and Chicago and New York and Philadelphia, Cleveland, Ohio, etc. But they're also going to be talking a lot about some of the resistance to voting for policies related to segregation. All right. So a lot of things, guys, when we think of civil rights problems or issues, they're going to have a lot to say about that. Right. And a lot of very creative things, poetry, short stories, things like that. Okay. And then our last big area of the day is going to be the development of mass media. Okay. So when you all think of mass media, my question to all of you is, does anything usually come to mind? For me, I think of social media. I think of the idea of informing the people, the public. How do we let people know about what's going on? Well, guys, in this time period, you're seeing the emergence of the radio, newspapers in larger numbers. Americans, guys, keep in mind, are starting to become more literate because they're in school more often. Okay, that trend will continue as we move further into the 40s, 50s, and beyond. Magazines, and then also the idea, you got it, of the movies. Okay. So, and there's going to be a major transition in this time period as far as movies, or as some people would call the silver screen. Okay. So you notice like a lot of silent films. All right. If you're familiar with actors like Charlie Chaplin, people that don't really, you can't hear them, but you can see them making interesting things. Like a lot of times you would see like interesting snides, if you will, toward authority, particularly police, etc. Well, imagine you move into the 1920s, and now you're noticing the ability to actually hear in the theaters. This is going to completely change the nature of a lot of things associated with film. I want you to think of the kinds of things that in your lifetimes, whether you're my age as an adult or maybe a youth or something like that, that changes in regards to how movies are made, the kind of technology that is used, and how that changes the nature of the way that we perceive culture within those films. Okay. The most important film in this time period, I would argue, is going to be The Jazz Singer. Okay. And I think it's important for a couple of reasons. And the first reason is you can see it's produced in the 1920s. Okay. But this is going to be a film that is actually a talkie film. So you're going to see somebody who has the ability to actually sing, the ability to dance. That's his picture there. Al Jolson was his American name, his stage name. But guys, I want you to check this out. Kind of a cool little story. Asa Yolson, I believe is how you say his last name. I believe, if I'm not mistaken, guys, that is not just an immigrant name, but is a name that comes from one of the Baltic states. I want to say it was Lithuanian and also Jewish. Okay, so here it is. You have an immigrant from another part of the world, right, that comes over to the United States, learns the English language, and then, of course, goes on to become one of the stars and one of the biggest icons of this time period. You'll notice here, guys, that as you can see, everybody's heard of Elvis. Everybody's heard of, those kinds of people in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. When we think of Elvis, we think of rock. We think of perhaps even the movies that he starred in, some of the other things. Guys, when we think of Al Jolson, it's a very similar kind of comparison. All right. So again, you notice a lot of similarities, differences too, but a lot of similarities between the post-war World War One period and also the post-war World War Two. Okay. For next time, we're going to pick this up with culture specifically, and also the big question on the screen here, which is when we're looking at the idea of culture creating conflict within our society between different groups. As always, this is Mr. Baker. Hope you had a great session with social and some cultural elements and developments of the 1920s. And I hope that you can say that you had a good time. Hope you learned a lot. As always, feel free to email me at bakerd@franklincomedy.org. And feel free to let me know if you have any suggestions or thoughts. And I will see you next time. Stay safe and have a good one. Thanks, guys. Bye.